and welcome to episode 10 of the Knitted by Whitney podcast. I can't believe we're into double digits already. This is so exciting. And I have quite the project to talk to you about today. But first, let's start with my mug of the episode. I do have a new mug. I picked this up at Michael's the other day. They only had 2 letters left and one of them was a W, so of course I snagged it. I'm drinking some black tea with honey, and I'm drinking one of my favorite teas from a local tea shop to me. I am drinking After 8 by World Tea House, which is located here in Nova Scotia. And After 8 is their black tea peppermint pink peppercorn blend, and it's so delicious. I absolutely recommend this tea. It's so good. Cheers. One of my favorites. So good. So this is going to be an interesting episode for me because it's the first time I'm going to be talking about a project that didn't quite work out. Now, I feel kind of weird about that because I don't like being negative and I don't like saying negative things about a pattern or a designer, but I also need to be honest about whether a pattern worked or not. It doesn't help anybody if I just always say good things about a pattern when it really wasn't that good for me. That being said, this pattern could work out for somebody else entirely. Maybe I just had a different experience. Who knows? But I just want to preface this video by saying I am not entirely happy with my final project, and it is too bad because I absolutely love the designer. She's a total sweetheart and I love her designs. So I feel kind of bad that I'm saying negative things about the pattern, but it just didn't work for me and I need to be honest about that. So let's dive into this pattern, shall we? This is the Sugarplum Jumper by Helen Arneson of Fable Knitwear. I absolutely love Helen's patterns. She designs primarily vintage-inspired patterns, very feminine style, very historical. She just has such an eye for creating a pattern based on a historical representation, which is absolutely beautiful. Unfortunately for me, those patterns don't always work with my body type, no matter how much I want them to. And I really need to accept that about these patterns, is that they're beautiful, but they don't always work for me. Case in point, this jumper. Let me start by saying this is one of Helen's earlier patterns, so that might have part of a say in why it didn't quite work for me, but it could also be that the pattern itself just isn't good for my body. Let's start with the yarn. I used Knit Picks limited edition Daydream DK, and I just want to preface this by saying I think it's absolutely ridiculous that this yarn was sold as a DK. There is no way this is a DK. I swatched this using the recommended needles, and I got such a tightly knitted up fabric that was just not very nice at all. It was stiff. It didn't feel nice against the skin. It didn't work at all. But when I swatched it with needles more in line with what you would use for a bulky weight, it was perfect. So I really think this yarn was wrongly advertised. I think it should have been marketed as a bulky, not as a DK, because it's very similar to Knit Picks Wonder Fluff, which is their other blown yarn that they have all the time, and even has a similar color to this. So if you like the look of this yarn, you can still get something very similar on Knit Picks' website. The color is called Pink Sapphire, and it is this glorious hot pink, which I loved the minute I saw it. And I had such a dream swatching this up on the bigger needles that I used. It was very flowy, it was very cozy, but because it's blown yarn, it's very light. There's a lot of pluses of this yarn, besides the fact that it was wrongly marketed as DK, and I personally believe should have been marketed as bulky. Moving on. So, let me talk about why I decided to make this pattern. About halfway through April, about halfway through April, maybe end of April, I had been working on my Loris sweater, which I'll put a picture here of, which is still in the whip pile. I know I usually don't have whips. I'm a one whip at a time kind of person, but I was doing this project. It was a fingering weight sweater, and I knew I wanted to take pictures with the cherry blossoms when they bloomed, which in Nova Scotia is typically end of May, beginning of June. And at that time, I had only just separated for my sleeves. And I was very worried that I was not going to finish that sweater in time to take pictures with the cherry blossoms. So I looked around in my stash for anything else that I could use that would be good for cherry blossom pictures. And of course, this hot pink yarn stood right out. And it's a very thick yarn. So I thought to myself, well, I could probably make something with this. And before even looking at patterns, I decided to swatch it up because, like I mentioned, it's marketed as a DK, but it didn't look like a DK to me. So I wanted to try swatching it with different sizes of needles. And the one that I liked the most was US size 11, which is about an 8mm. I loved the fabric that I got with those needles. That is actually what I used for the stockinette portion of this sweater. So you can kind of see this is what I was working with. It's nice and loose and stretchy. It's got a really nice fabric to it, nice flow, that kind of thing. And I really liked that. And I know you can search on Ravelry for patterns by gauge, but I was getting kind of frustrated by that. And I didn't quite know what size yarn to look for in a pattern in order to narrow my search. And I was just kind of getting overwhelmed by options. So I put out a call on my Instagram stories and I asked people for suggestions. And I got some really nice suggestions, and I ended up going with the Sugarplum jumper that I am sharing with you today. And I loved the idea of it because it was this like cozy turtleneck sweater that was loose and had these like really nice poofy sleeves. It just looked like exactly what I wanted to use this yarn for. Because this yarn is hot pink, but it's also very fuzzy, it's very fluffy, I thought that's the perfect garment because it's got feminine touches to it, but it's also just a cozy sweater, perfect for cold weather. I'm recording this the third week of June. It's not chilly weather that you need a cozy sweater for anymore. So I'm quite warm at the moment, but I need to have the jumper on in order to talk to you about it. So here we are. So I ended up starting that jumper, and I have been doing a lot of top-down sweaters for the past few years. That is my preferred way of doing a sweater. And this pattern was a bottom-up sweater. And at first I thought, do I really want to do a bottom-up sweater? They're not my favorite. I usually have fit problems with them. You really don't get an idea of how your sweater is working out until you're almost at the end. And by that point, what do you do? It's kind of too late to fix it. But I learned it's not too late to fix it, which I'm going to talk about today. But I decided to try it anyway because maybe I was in a rut. Maybe I needed to try something different. And I actually surprised myself. I was really enjoying the construction of this sweater. I started with the body. I used a US 10, which is, I think, a 6 or 7 millimeter. I'll put it here on the screen for my ribbing. This is not my original ribbing. I'll talk about that later. So I used that for my body ribbing and for my turtleneck, which is actually a cowl neck. I'll talk about that as well. And I thought I would use the same size for my sleeve cuffs. However, based on the number of stitches that I needed, I couldn't use my 16-inch circular needles. I needed to use my little 12-inch circulars. And I didn't have one in size 10. They don't make it in size 10. They cap out at size 9. But I don't have a size 9. I have a size 8. So I decided to use my 8s for my sweater cuffs, and it worked out fine. In fact, I kind of like how stiff and snug these cuffs are. It really helps the body of the sleeve be controlled, in my opinion. So those are the needle sizes that I used, and other than the fact that I really couldn't take any progress photos at all, I really enjoyed doing a bottom-up sweater. That's actually the worst part about doing a bottom-up sweater. Not the worst, it's one of the worst things about a bottom-up sweater is you can't take any decent progress photos. Because essentially, you're knitting a rectangle, or a tube rather, because it's in the round. So you're knitting this plain rectangular tube until you get to where your armpits would be. So you have this, like, if you lay it down flat, you have this big square of knitting. And then you do your sleeves the same way. So once I had a bit of work done on my sleeves, I was able to take a progress photo of my sleeves, which I'll put right here. And I lucked out with when I was able to take pictures of my sleeves because at that time the phlox was in bloom. Phlox is just like this little hot pink ground flower that grows, and it's absolutely beautiful. But it's really only in bloom for like a couple of days, and then it starts to get really ugly and ratty because it gives way to just like some greenish, weedy grass looking thing. I don't really know anything about gardening. I just know the flowers are pretty and they matched my sweater. So I was lucky enough that I could take pictures of it with my sleeves. And at that time of year, the cherry blossoms were already in bloom and I had not finished my sweater. And this year in Nova Scotia, our cherry blossoms came out early and they died really quickly. So I didn't even get a chance to go see them, which was really sad. I did see some. We have a cherry tree in our front yard, but it's a very tall cherry tree, so I wouldn't have been able to take pictures with our own tree anyway, unless I had that horrible from below angle, and would not have looked good. But I'll insert a photo of our cherry tree just here so you can see that. So at that point, I hadn't even assembled my sweater in order to be able to do the yoke, let alone finish the sweater. So that was unfortunate. But I can tell you why I hadn't reached that point. It wasn't because I had started too late. It wasn't because I'm a slow knitter. It was because for about 2 full weeks at the end of April, beginning of May, well, maybe more mid-May, I got very, very busy at work. We had to move part of our collection from one building to another, which is extremely physically demanding as well as mentally demanding because it's not as simple as when you just move apartments and you take your books from one bookshelf and put them on that bookshelf in the new place. We have to make sure everything went back on the shelf in the correct order so that you'd be able to find the books again. So doing that for 7 to 8 hours a day for 2 straight weeks exhausted me. And it exhausted me physically as well as mentally. And I just couldn't pick up my needles. I couldn't work on my project. I needed to just sit and watch TV with my fiance or maybe read a chapter of my book at night. But I was just drained and I didn't want to do any knitting. So I gave up on my Laura sweater temporarily because I wanted to start a different sweater in order to get that one done in time for the cherry blossoms because I knew I couldn't get the Laura's done in time for the cherry blossoms. And I still didn't get this one done in time for the cherry blossoms. Oh well. I guess it just wasn't meant to be. That's all I can say. So once this big project at work was over, I was able to pick up my needles again, get some work done on this sweater, but it was just taking forever. And I couldn't really understand why was my project taking so long. I remember being so excited when I finally joined the sleeves and the body to start the yoke, because it is a raglan yoke. So once you join it, you start doing all your decreases. And I thought, once I'm at the yoke, it'll go like that. It's going to go so fast. I'm going to get this done quickly, and then the neck won't take me very long at all. That might take me like an evening, and then I could get this off the needles, and then I can do my podcast episode, take my pictures. It'll all be great. It didn't end up being like that. When I finally did get to the yoke, it took forever and ever and ever. I think it's just because I underestimated how many stitches I would have to do my yoke, and although you're doing decreases every like second row or whatever, you're still using a large number of stitches until you get closer to your neckline. And it was when I was doing the yoke that I started to see problems. I started to see I had a problem with the length. And not just the length of the body, I also had a problem with the length of the sleeves. Now, I will preface this by saying I did knit a longer body than the pattern recommended, and that's because I have knit other of Helen's patterns, and I have found for those ones that I did, most of the time the body has been too short for me because she makes quite cropped styles. And when you have a round belly, like I do, you kind of need it to be a bit longer so that it still looks that proper crop style on you. Or on me rather. So that's why I knit an extra long length for the body of this pattern, and that ended up being a big mistake. There's a lot of things that sort of went into how this pattern didn't fit me right, but adding length myself was a big X no. So when I finished most of my yoke and I still had some more yoke decreases to do, I tried it on and it looked clownish. It was crazy. My sleeves went about this far past my fingers. My length was down below my butt, and I still hadn't even finished the yoke decreases, so I still had to do more length in the yoke. But I tried it on, and I already knew that I didn't want a tight turtleneck for this pattern, primarily because it's very, very fluffy. I don't necessarily want very, very fluffy and snug on my neck like this, which is very uncomfortable for me. And I'm also not a turtleneck person because I have a very short neck and a very round face. So turtlenecks don't look good on me, and I never make them, and I never wear them. So I knew I was going to try and keep more circumference at the top of my yoke anyway before doing my turtleneck. So when I had most of the increases done and I only had like a few more rows of increases to do, I tried it on, and that's when I found out all the issues with the length. But I also saw that I was quite happy with where the neckline was, so I decided to stop there and transition into doing the ribbed neck, which I just changed to my smaller needles, my 10s, and I started working on that. And I was hoping that once I started the neck, it would really suck in the top because I'm using a smaller needle and I'm doing ribbing versus stockinette. And I thought that would sort of help pull the jumper up so that it wouldn't be quite so long and my sleeves wouldn't be quite so long. But it didn't do that. So I ended up having to make some choices later on. I recorded some footage of trying on the sweater in its original form when I had almost finished doing the neck. And I'm going to insert that here so you can see what it originally looked like and how I decided what I was going to do to fix it. Okay, so I haven't quite finished my sweater yet. I still have some more of the neck to do. Right now my turtleneck only comes up about this high, and I want it to come up this high and then fold over. So about twice as much left to do, but I have a good idea now about where the yoke of the sweater sits on me. And I think you can tell there's some problems. Some of them are of my own making, some of them are the pattern. So let's start with the obvious, the length. This is far too long. If I turn around, you can see this already comes like way below my butt. It already comes way below my butt, which not the length I wanted for this sweater. I actually wanted this sweater more so about this length, which, let's see if I can play around with that to make it the right length. There. So this is what I wanted more so for my length. So that is at least, I want to say 4 to 5 inches too much length. So I'm going to do something that I have not done before. Little nervous about it, but I feel pretty confident. I'm going to do some sweater surgery. So sweater surgery is when you pick up stitches in 2 spots. So for example, right above my ribbing, and then again like where the other side of the section I want to take out. So it'd be easier if I put it in like this. Put it on the inside. There we go. So put my needle through a line of stitches along here, and then again in the next spot up where I want those 2 places to meet, get those 2 rows onto a set of needles, cut this excess, and then graft them together with Kitchener stitch, which I am totally okay with Kitchener stitch. It's really easy to do, and it leaves a very flawless finish. You don't even notice that you've taken out a chunk of knitting and then put the 2 pieces together again. So I'm going to do that for the body, and I might have to do the same thing with the sleeves because this is how long my sleeves are. Not quite the length that I need, a little long, a lot long actually. From my experience of doing Fable knitwear patterns before, I have learned that she makes her sleeves very long, and I must have very short arms because I always seem to have trouble with her sleeves being too long. And she loves to have these nice big balloony sleeves, which if they're not too long, they look really, really nice. But if they're too long, they just sort of fold over the cuff and then you can't see the cuff anymore. So if I compare what my sweater sleeves look like compared to what Helene's looks like, there's a very big difference, literally. So hers are more, I would say, more about this amount of poofiness or bagginess. So again, I have about 4 to 5 inches of knitting to take out. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to pick up a row, not quite right after the ribbing, a couple of rows after that because you did do a couple rows of increases right here at the cuff. So I'll pick up some stitches there and then I'll gauge how much I need to take out, pick up a line of stitches there, cut that bit out, and graft them together with Kitchener stitch. So sweater surgery is on my plate now. So first let's do a bit of a before. This is with the sleeves down. And with the sleeves up. So hopefully I will have a much better fitting sweater when this is all said and done. So as you can see in that footage, the sweater that I had pre-sweater surgery looked incredibly different to the sweater that I'm wearing now, which up until now you haven't seen very well because I'm sitting down and I'm chatting about it. I haven't shown you any final pictures. So at the time of recording, I still haven't taken my final photos. Doyle and I are going to go to a lupin field near where we live after he gets back from the hike that he's doing right now with the dog, and I'll take some really nice photos then. I also wanted to wait till it was, not so hot and sunny because I'm in this really thick, fluffy sweater. So we're probably going to go around early evening, sunset-y kind of time, which I think would be really pretty. So. So one of the problems with this sweater, beyond the problems of my own making, is that there's no row gauge given in this pattern. There's only a stitch gauge. And I think that might have been part of my problem, is that I didn't know how different my row gauge was from the sweater sample. Which is also misleading, because in the photos for the Sugarplum jumper, Helen is wearing what looks like quite an oversized jumper, and unless you read her notes from her own sample that she put on Ravelry, she's actually not wearing the size that she would typically wear. She knit a size larger so that she would have extra positive ease for that design. So that was sort of, I wouldn't call it a red flag, but it was something to note when I was looking at this pattern. Because usually the sample that the designer shows is what it should fit like on you as well. So without her very clearly saying that she had knit, let's say, size 3 instead of size 2, and she had X number of centimeters of positive ease, then when you go to knit that pattern, you're going to assume that how it looks on the designer or on the model of the sample is how it's going to look on you, and that's not what happened with this pattern. Mine looks quite large on me, but that's because I used larger needles and had larger gauge. Helen's stitch gauge was 14 stitches per 10 centimeters, or 4 inches. With myself using 8mm needles, US 11s, I got a 12 stitch gauge and an 18 row gauge. I don't know what her row gauge was because she didn't share it in the pattern. So I don't know if my row gauge was comparable or if it was way off the mark. I don't know. All I know is that my sweater is too long in different places. So I was able to fix how it was too long in the sleeves and in the body, as you have seen when you saw my original footage versus my finished object photos. But something that I wasn't able to fix myself, because I just don't have the brain power to do it, is the yoke. So if I hold my hands up like this, you can see this is where the armpit of my sweater is. My actual armpit is way over here. So that is a significant amount of positive ease in the yoke. And the yoke just really doesn't fit me at all, because I needed to have more decreases and I needed to have them faster so that my armpits, instead of being way down here, could be further up here. Like, I don't want them like really snug up against my armpits. When you have like this fluffy, bulky knit sweater, you don't want it to be skin tight. But I also don't want it to be so large that it's kind of shapeless on my body. So that was unfortunate. And that is a downside of the pattern itself. So I feel bad that I have to say something bad about the pattern, but that's just how it is. And because the yoke is so large, it pulls down on my neckline. So my neckline, my ribbing starts right here. This should be up here. But because my yoke is so loose and it falls down, it pulls my neckline down. Which I'm not entirely upset about, because like I mentioned, I wanted a cowl neck, not a turtleneck. But I didn't necessarily want my collar to be so low that you could see the t-shirt I'm wearing underneath. Like, even if I'm wearing a pink t-shirt to match the pink sweater, I don't necessarily want people to see the t-shirt I'm wearing underneath the sweater. I want them to see the sweater. Another thing about this pattern around like the yoke and the chest is that there are no short rows in this pattern. So I had read that in someone else's notes about making this pattern, and they said that they did their own short rows. And I thought, wait, I could do that too. Like, I've never done it before, but if I follow what I did in another pattern that I've used where they tell you exactly how to do your short rows, I can sort of mimic that in this sweater. So I did, and I did 4 rows of short rows. Because the sweater is a raglan construction, I knew I was starting on the back shoulder. So I knew that I could just go in between my 2 raglan stitch markers that would tell me that's where my back is. So I can put my short rows in there. So that's how I managed to make this a nice cowl neck that comes up a little higher in the back and it's a little lower in the front. I also did that because I hate being choked by my sweaters. I like to have space between my neck and whatever neckline of my sweater that I have. For example, this one's a cowl neck. So I always add German short rows to my sweaters because that helps them sit much nicer on my neck. So now let's talk about what I did for sweater surgery. I kind of talked about it in that segment that I showed you, but let me kind of show you what I did. I first took some scrap yarn and I threaded it through close to the cuff of the sweater because I couldn't go right at the cuff because there's some increases right here. That's how you get this nice balloon sleeve. So I just went like a couple of rows up where I knew the increases had been finished. And then I put my sweater on and I let the sleeve fall down like I showed you in that clip. And I measured up 15 centimeters and then I thread a needle through that row. And then I counted how many rows that I had done in that span of 15 centimeters so that I could copy it on the other sleeve. I wanted everything to look exactly the same. And what I did then, I know it sounds scary, but I cut a stitch and I started to unravel an entire row. Originally for the first sleeve, I undid it at one end and cut it and pulled it all out so that I still had about a row or 2 of scrap yarn that I would then use to graft it back together. And I just then unraveled the whole sleeve all the way down to the other row where I was going to graft it together. And that took a long time. So when I did the second one, I cut my yarn and I undid it so that the sleeve popped off. And then instead of unraveling that whole section of sleeve, I just then cut it again close to that other row that I had picked up and did the same thing so that I then had this whole chunk of sleeve that I could pull out and just have that for scrap yarn. It just took way less time than unraveling all of that entire section of sleeve because this yarn is sticky. Now what I mean by that is that the fibers love to hang on to each other for dear life. So it takes quite a lot of pulling and snipping little tiny bits that got like almost felted together so that I could have the actual strand of yarn again. And it was a lot of work, but it was worth it because then I could have the proper length sleeves. So to graft them back together, I followed, it's basically Kitchener stitch, but instead of putting 2 sides of one circle together and doing Kitchener stitch, you're basically you have it on 2 sets of needles and you're going in and out both strands of yarn. I'm not an expert, it just happened to work for me. And I was very happy that it did. So that's how I did my sleeves. And if I'm honest, I maybe took a little bit too much off because these are more like bracelet length rather than wrist length, and I prefer wrist length, but again, it's not that much work to just pull down my sleeves. I can still get them over my hands like I like to wear them when it's cold out, so I'm fine with it. What I did with the body was a little bit different. I tried the sweater on in its super long length, and I put a stitch marker in the row where I wanted the stockinette body to end and ribbing to start. And then I cut below that and pulled off a huge chunk of my sweater. It ended up being 20 centimeters of sweater, including the original ribbing. Now, the reason I didn't do the same grafting technique that I did with the sleeves is that my ribbing before was too tight. And that's because I did my cast on row far too tight. That was my own fault. I always use German twisted cast on for any stretchy cast on that I need. But the problem with doing it this time around is that I did it way too tight. So I'm learning this about myself. When I do my German twisted cast on, I pull my yarn too tight. And then I end up with a very, very tight cast on row. And then any of my ribbing afterwards comes out much wider than the cuff itself. So this was also done with German twisted cast on. So you can see that the ribbing itself is pretty stretchy. It is stretched out because it was on smaller needles and I needed it to fit me. But you can see that the actual cast on itself is stretched to the max and it doesn't really have a lot of elasticity left to it. So that's something that I'm learning about my German twisted cast on. I need to get better at making it a little looser. Now I've heard a tip that you can use where you hold two needles together to make sure that your cast on is loose. So what I would do is maybe try having my original needle and then having a much smaller needle held with it so that it's not going to be significantly looser. It's just going to be that little bit looser that I need so that I don't have this non-elastic cast on anymore, because the whole purpose of the cast on is to be stretchy. That's why I do it with ribbing all the time. So once I'd marked off where I wanted my new ribbing to start, I just started knitting new ribbing. I didn't bother doing any more stockinette or anything like that. I just picked up the stitches and knit down. And if I'm being honest, I don't love the length. It is more of the cropped length that Helen had for her version of the sweater, but I just don't love it. I don't know if maybe it's just one of those in-between lengths for me. You know, it's not quite full length, but it's also not quite cropped. It's almost like it looks like I knit the wrong length, which it's really possible. Like, I did so many things to this sweater to try and salvage it that it's kind of a Frankenstein garment right now, and it's still not what I wanted it to be, and that's too bad. So I probably won't wear this sweater very much, and if I do wear it, it will only be around the house, if I'm wearing like high-waisted leggings and I just want something cozy, or if I'm wearing like, I have pajamas that are like a jumpsuit, then I'll wear it then. But I don't see myself getting a lot of wear out of this, which is honestly too bad, because I love the color. I think it's so fun. The yarn is super fluffy and cozy. It's really nice, but I don't see myself frogging all this yarn to try and make something else. And that's because I had such a hard time pulling out one strand in order to take out some length and graft things back together. It was so sticky. And I just know that frogging an entire sweater like that would just make me too frustrated, and I just don't think it's worth it. So I'll keep this not so great sweater to wear once in a while. I think you already know the answer to the question, will I make this pattern again? And I'm sorry to say it, but the answer is no. It didn't fit right. And when I'm making my own clothes, when I'm spending so much time making something, I want it to fit me perfectly. And when it really doesn't fit me well at all, well, that's not a good way to spend my time or use up yarn. So unfortunately, I won't make this pattern again. I will still make some of Helen's patterns again in the future. She has some beautiful cardigans that I think would be really nice. She actually recently released a book of all of her patterns, but it's only available in Norwegian right now. When it's eventually released in English, I am going to buy it because I would love to have all of those patterns in a book. Her photography is gorgeous. Her hair and makeup always looks beautiful. And I really see myself wearing some of those designs, just not this one, which is honestly too bad. But that is my honest review of the Sugarplum jumper. Something I forgot to mention, I used a new to me tip that I want to share with you about this project. So because this is a blown yarn, I didn't want to use the typical joining methods that I already knew. So I actually saw a reel on Instagram, which I will link below, showing how to do a technique called wefting. If you're familiar with the weave-in-steven method, this will seem pretty familiar. So the way that wefting works is you take your old strand of yarn and your new strand of yarn, and you just sort of like fold them over each other so that you have like an extra bit of the end on each side, but they are sort of like linked like a chain. And then you just keep knitting with them and you knit those ends into your work. So of course I'll link the Instagram reel below so you can see how that works. But I found that it was actually a really, really great method of joining yarn with a blown style yarn because it's incredibly invisible. So I have, at this little spot on my sweater, on the back you can see I have a little bit of an end here and a little bit of an end here. But if I turn it the other way around, can you tell where the join was? Because I can't. It's incredibly invisible, and I was really happy with that. Now for my book review of the episode. I only have one this time. Similar to being in a knitting slump, I'm also in a bit of a reading slump. I just haven't been able to find something that I'm really interested lately. My goal for 2022 was to focus on reading books that I have never read before instead of just falling back on rereading some of my favorite books, because 2021 I did a lot of rereading. And I mainly did that because, second year of the pandemic, I just wanted comfort reads. I just wanted to read something I knew I was going to love and really, really enjoy. This year I'm trying to branch out, get out of my comfort zone. I have been doing a lot of fantasy reading lately, and maybe I needed to read something different. So I picked up something different, even though, according to the library, it is still a fantasy book because it has a fantasy sticker on it. But I wouldn't really classify this as fantasy. I would classify this just as like general literature. So I'm currently reading The Sea House by Elizabeth Gifford. This is a story set in Scotland. It tells two parallel stories. One is of a woman named Ruth, who she and her husband bought an old decrepit, they call it a manse or manse, M-A-N-S-E. And it used to be the home of the local vicar or reverend or something like that. But they've bought it in order to turn it into a B&B. And when they are doing all of their renovations, they discovered the remains of a child. And this child has something special about it. It has its legs fused together and it looks like a merchild. So it is a real medical condition that can happen. But in the story of this book, it's talking about the story of selkies, which are seal people that can change from human into seal. So the main character, Ruth, has a history of selkies in her family, or at least folklore about selkies in her family history. So she has this really strong connection to this child. So she starts to look into the history of the house, and she discovers, through the help of the current vicar, or reverend something, I'm not up on my religious titles, she finds the diaries of the reverend who lived there at the time that their remains would have been buried. I think it's around roughly 1860. So that is the other parallel story in this book, and that is Alexander Ferguson, who is the reverend of the time, and it's telling the two stories back to back. I am about 100 pages in, so I can't make a full judgment, but I will say it feels like the modern day story is largely unnecessary at this point. The most interesting parts of the book are the parts written by Alexander in the 1860s. And then it also has chapters from the point of view of his maid, Moira. So their chapters are much more interesting than the ones about Ruth and her husband that are fixing up the house. But overall, it's a very meh book. I am not enthralled by it. I don't hate it. It's just very much in the middle. Maybe it will pick up. Maybe it won't. I don't know. I have yet to see. I haven't given up on it. I'm just reading a chapter or two a night before we go to bed. But I just haven't found a book lately that has really hooked me. So I'm okay with reading a book that I just feel okay about. But there is one not so great thing about this book. And it's on this page right here. Ruth goes into a store to find a knitting pattern. And it says here, pages of instructions and numbers, a dense code that bore no relation to my clumsy knit one, purl one. But let me show you how they spelled purl. That is not how you spell purl when it comes to knitting instructions. That is the pearl that you find in an oyster. So, as a knitter, that gets one bad tick. Reading a book that spells purl the wrong way when it comes to knitting. That's an editor who missed one little word and let a wrong spelling go forward. But other than that, The Sea House is just an okay book. And that is it for episode 10 of the Knitted by Whitney podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, even though I was reviewing a not so great pattern, and I hope it was helpful to you. It is unfortunate that this sweater didn't work out, but not everything we do works out. So my podcast couldn't always be completely positive. If you enjoyed this video, please give a thumbs up, leave me a comment. Actually, if you don't mind, I have been in a bit of a reading slump, so I'd really appreciate it if you could leave me some book suggestions down below. I love a lot of different genres. Fantasy is, of course, my number one. The only genre I really don't like is sci-fi. I just can't get into it. I'm really sorry if you're a sci-fi fan, but I would love it if you could comment on this video and leave me a book recommendation below. And hopefully I'll get something fun to read out of it. So thank you so much for joining me today. If this is your first time, welcome. And if you are a returning viewer, thank you so much for coming back. I really appreciate it. If you like my content, feel free to subscribe. I love sharing my reviews of patterns as well as some other specialty videos. I have a video out of my top 50 size inclusive free patterns. And I have some more videos like that planned for the future. I might have another one coming out maybe this summer, maybe this fall. I don't know yet. Wait and see how it goes. But I hope you will be there to join me with that. Thank you all so much for watching. Everyone, take care. Bye.